Today what we're going to make is a pair of 14th century turn shoes based on shoe number 99 in the book Shoes and Patents by Francis Grew and Margaret de Neergaard. I'm going to show you one method of shoe construction for turn shoes. There are actually 3 different methods that I use. To make this sort of shoe, you're going to need a wooden last to stretch your leather over. This is a commercial wooden last from the 1950s or 60s, and it was ground to a point to have a much more medieval shape. There are people who carve these by hand. I don't happen to be one of those. You'll also need a pattern. This particular pattern was made for nailed shoe construction, which I've demonstrated in other videos. It's a lot bigger than would be needed for a shoe of this sort in this size. So what I'm going to do is just test fit it, do a little dry fit in cardboard. I've made a copy of this pattern, and I'm going to make some adjustments to it. I'm just going to lay the piece on and just run my magic marker around the pattern so I have a rough idea where things are. And I'm going to trim the pattern accordingly. In order to keep the pattern uniform, I fold it neatly in half so that I can keep the pattern symmetrical. And I trim off slightly less material than I marked on my pattern. And this should produce a shoe that is roughly where I want it to be. I'm not taking all the material off that I had indicated because I want to be sure that I have enough extra material to go over the piece. It should now fit pretty well. It doesn't have to fit exactly. For this method of shoe construction, I don't leave much of a lasting margin. All leather will provide you with a little bit of stretch. And up here, there is material above the last that will actually be pulled in this direction. This works well if you have leather that's not very stretchy. If you've got leather that's extremely stretchy, you might cut this pattern even more closely, even tighter to the last, maybe even a little short, and you'll pull the stretch out of the leather. When I'm doing this, I cut off material from my pattern because I don't need extra. However, sometimes your pattern will be too small. In that case, I use a photocopier and blow it up to the right size and then trim it to fit accordingly. At this point, what I'm going to do is pre-mark where all my holes go. I have this pattern tracing wheel. It's a stitching wheel. And I'm just running it around the edge of the piece. Now that I've got them all marked, and I'm sure they won't show up on camera, what I do is I use an awl. And the key is, what you do is you take your needle, this does not have to be a curved awl, I just like it, and you push it in and you wiggle it forward until the needle comes out halfway through the thickness of the leather. And then you pull it out. And then you move to the next spot and do the same thing. You want to be careful when you're doing this that you don't rip through the leather, because that's very easy to do. And if you do, you're pretty much out of luck for that stitch. You just have to work around it. If you come out too shallow, I see this one is about to come up very close to the sole, scoot back in and change your angle. That's much better. One of the nice things about this awl is it does have a thicker shank back here, so if I need to widen the hole, I just push it a little farther. And I have a tendency to pre-awl a bunch of my holes, but not necessarily all of my holes. You can do this whole shoe beforehand, before you ever start sewing. I've almost finished awling my holes, and as I'm doing this, there are a couple things that occur to me. If you have to go too deep or too shallow, it's better to go too deep. The trouble is you could wear through the stitches more easily. Shooting for the middle of the thickness is what you're aiming for, but you're not always going to get there. And if you have to go a choice between too far from the edge or too close to the edge, I would much rather have you come in towards the center of the leather. I built my workbench to be very close to chin height, so as I'm working this I can see exactly what I'm doing, and everything is right here in my face. And I have pre-auled all of my holes. At this point I'm ready to move on to my next step. I've cut my pattern piece out of a piece of elk hide. You can use cowhide, pig hide, goat hide. There's all kinds of documentation for different sorts of leather. I chose elk because I like the way it works, not because of a particular medieval need for it to be elk. I don't know of any surviving shoes that were made out of elk. I lay it with the side that will be the out towards the inside of my last, stretch the piece around, and overlap the seam. Now when I'm finished, I'll have a butted seam. Use an awl, and I make a hole. I take a threaded needle with some waxed cord, and in this case I want to tie it off. This is not part of the shoe construction. This is part of the stretching process. I mean, it's part of the shoe construction in that you have to do it before you can sew it, but I'm not ready to sew yet. So I'm just going to tie a nice little knot here, come across to the other side, make another hole, and run it through. This can be done wet, and I often do it wet. What would happen if you did it wet is you'll have to wait and let the piece dry. In this case, I don't want to do that. I can make a fine shoe with leather that's this stretchy when it's completely dry. And I want to just sort of push everything to where it's supposed to be. Okay, at this point, I've made a loop. And I'm going to make another hole. And come across. And I'm going to make a kind of a spider web pattern out of my stitching here. Right now it's really sloppy looking. But it is something that you probably are going to need to do because you want to get everything nice and tight and held in the way and in the place that you want it to be. That just fell right back in my lap. And I keep going, and I make my pattern. Oops. Okay. This leather is super stretchy, just really, really stretchy. So I want to be sure that I pull as much of the stretch out of the leather as I can. What it means is the pattern I made is too big for the shoe that I'm making. That's okay. I'll just cut it all away. As I'm doing this, I'm continually adjusting the place of the sole. I don't want the sole to get out of whack while I'm doing this, because it really won't work if you do. So don't let the sole escape, and don't do that either. I'm going to take 2 or 3 more stitches here and tie it off. The reason for tying it off is because as you go, you're going to wind up cutting this stuff. And you want to be able to cut without any loss. Actually, I said 2 or 3 more stitches. I think it's only going to be 2. Alright, here we go. Pull it back. And tie a knot. Okay, now with this knot, I can then move on and work my way up the toe and then start again in the back of the shoe, and then I'll be ready to finish it up. When I'm working the toe, I want to be sure I tie off often, and also I take a lot of fairly tight stitches to bring all this material in. I've pre-auled these. I'm just trying to find the hole. And so I've got this flap right here. That's not a problem. I just want to make sure I'm bringing it someplace out of the way. So I make another hole further back. And I just draw it back. I'm going to tie that off so that it doesn't get loose on me. Happen to have a thread here, so I'm just going to tie it to that. A little stronger there. Then I come back. I've got these kind of ear flaps here. So then the next step is to hit down. I can't find the hole I pre-auled there, so I'm just going to make a new one. I'm having a little trouble here. There we go. There we go. Bring it back. And the same thing over on this side. Once again, I'm going to tie it off, and I have a thread here. And there we go, look at that. And I still got a little bit more material. I'm going to take an even bigger bite out of there. If I can. If I can get the needle in there. There we go. Now this would all be great. And you could let the leather dry, and it will it'll do what it needs to do if you're doing it wet. I happen to be doing this dry, so I don't have to let it dry. But I do feel a need to stretch it anyway to get some of the stretch out of the leather so that it doesn't stretch once it gets on the wearer's foot. Once again, I'm going to tie this off. It's a rainy day. You can hear the sump pump running and everything down here in the basement. Alright, I've done the front part of the shoe. Now I'll do the same for the back part, and we'll be ready to come back. What you see here is a surviving example of a 15th century shoe sole. And we can see very similar patterns to the one that we created etched into the leather. This was clearly done wet. But if we zoom in, you can see very definite signs that they used a cross-lacing technique at some point during the construction of these shoes. Not necessarily at this point. It's possible that this occurred at some other point. I don't know of any definite evidence that says they did this exactly the way I'm talking about. But it's the method of shoe construction that works for me, and I think this is pretty good suggestive evidence that says that they might have used this. Interestingly, I have cross-stitched in the same places that the medieval example has. I'm not going to need any in the heel portion, and there aren't any marks in the heel portion of these shoes. At this point, I'm ready to start sewing. I have a single thread with a needle on each end. And I'm going to start on the back of the shoe where it fits up pretty closely. There, went through just fine. And now I'm pulling the thread so that the two needles wind up in the center, and I've got even amounts. And now I snug everything down, and I'm ready to move on to the next one. Make my stitching hole, and now both needles are going to pass through. One needle from the outside, one needle from the inside. And if I want, I can widen the holes, because they're both going to pass there. That one goes, and this one goes in the opposite direction. I'm sewing with a waxed linen thread, which is about as authentic as I can get. I'm not using boar bristles, which I know is a medieval technique. I'm using steel Glover's needles. They're slightly sharp, but for this they don't really need to be. Simply what I've got. They're pretty thin, but their eyes are big enough to go into the thread. And I know there are people who are really good at this, who sew at the same time. They pull both needles through the hole at the same time. I just find that takes up too much. And of course, you can break your needle just like I did. So I'm going to have to rethread this needle, and I'll come back. Okay, at this point I'm back, and I have rethreaded my needles, and I've passed the needles through the hole. Sometimes we'll use a pair of pliers if things are stubborn. And then I'm ready to pass the other needle going in the other direction. When I pull them tight. When I rethreaded my needle, I chose a much thicker needle for the second one, simply because it was handy. But also, it does make it easier if that's the first one to go through. That other needle will just slip right through. If you've managed to get the thick one through, the thin one goes no problem. Thick one through, thin one through, and tighten it up. After every stitch, I tighten it down. Now you notice I've got this little bit of extra leather here. That's okay. I'll just cut it away when I'm done. Use the awl. Make the hole through the sole, and then I come around it just to widen up that hole, make it nice and big. And now I just keep going around the shoe just like this. Occasionally as you're going, you break a thread and you wind up tying it off. I think I broke mine because the sharp needle actually pierced the linen thread. You notice I've got a lot of material here, a lot of height. That's fine. This will all simply be trimmed away when I'm finished. Now when you're working, you got to be really careful, otherwise you can awl your fingers pretty badly, and then you wind up getting blood everywhere, and that's kind of bad. As you can see, I've worked all the way up here. I'll put another 3 stitches in and then quit. Now I'm going to work here to this point and then quit, and then I'll move forward. Okay, at this point I've sewed those remaining stitches up to this And now I've taken the thread and I've just wrapped it into here. I don't want to cut it off, but I don't want it to be in my way. So it's now wrapped and out of the way. I'll pull it out when I need it. I'm now ready to start again on this end, and I will do my best to stitch in a way that allows you to see what I'm doing. Same deal as before. And my holes aren't big enough, obviously. So I'm just going to touch them up with the awl. And it's just like starting from scratch. So I take my awl, I push it through the hole, I find the opening, and I pull until I've got both ends of the thread evened up. Now I'm ready to go. Take one needle in each hand, push it through, forgot to awl the hole. The needle through from one direction, and then use the same hole to go through from the other direction. And tighten it down, go to the next one. Make my hole plenty big. And sew it through. One side and the other. At this point, I've sewed all the way around the entire heel. I started from here, went this direction, then I started again here, went this direction, and I've gone up to the side seam. I've trimmed away some excess material, and you notice the side seam doesn't meet. That's not a problem. This leather has so much stretch that this will just butt right up against it, and it'll sew beautifully. No problems at all. But right now, what I want to do is start sewing forward, and I'll come back and do that side seam in a little bit. Okay, at this point, I've got all this excess material. It doesn't need to be here. My favorite tool for this is a razor blade. Brand new, sharp as can be. They make some specialized skiving tools. I don't happen to like them as well as I like a brand new, fresh, sharp razor blade. You have to be really careful when you're doing this so that you don't wind up cutting your thread or cutting too shallow, cutting too deep, I should say. You want to make sure you have enough of a margin there so everything holds together. And I'm basically going to come up close to where I finished. But I'm going to cut it a little short of that because I want to make sure I have all my material. At this point, I've got a fairly decent edge, got enough material to hold everything, and this is nice and smooth. At this point, I'm ready to move forward into this seam area. So I've made a hole, I've pushed my needle through from one side and same from the other. There we go. Sometimes it gets tough. You use the pliers. And you got to be careful not to get your thread all tangled. It does not work as well when it's tangled. In order to relieve some of the tension, I made a slit here before the first thread, and I actually just trimmed it a little bit. So this thread now is hanging loose and not pulling this side in as tightly, but because I've sewn it here, it's really not an issue, and it's going to be that way as we work forward. That's why I tied it off in several places, so that we always have an anchor point and the whole thing won't go flying apart. So then I continue doing the same thing I was doing before. Make my hole with the awl. If you're worried about your fingers, you can put a piece of leather behind it. Give yourself something to push against. Widen it up. You can do a couple of holes next to each other. Oops. So at this point, I can now just start moving forward with a couple of stitches. As to your hole spacing, it's a matter of preference. As I said, when I used the layout wheel, it was the tightest spacing I had a layout wheel for. But if you compare it to real medieval examples, they're often much farther apart. If you look at how far apart they are here, you know, I'm hole, 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 there, hole, 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 hole. Quite a bit of difference. There's a good 1/4 inch between their stitches. Just a matter of style, matter of preference. I've cut all these tabs and I'll continue to cut them. But unfortunately this side was getting a little loose. So I've taken the thread that had been over here that had been attached to this tab and permanently just tied a knot in both ends, keeping this side tight, because I really don't want it to get all loose here. And I'll do that every so often as I go through. I just want to make sure everything stays as tight as I can possibly make it. Now that I've tied that, I've cut another tab, and I'm just going to keep moving forward doing the same thing I was doing. Make a hole, sew it up. I'm doing about 2 or 3 holes at a shot, usually 3. Sometimes I'll do more. In this case, I'll probably do 5. Pre-awling them and stitching them up. Making shoes in this way is reasonably time-consuming, but not something you can't take with you. You can do it in any location. You can do it sitting watching TV. Well, not really watching TV at that point. It's more listening to TV, because your eyes need to be focused here. But you can do it on the road, and occasionally you're going to break the thread, just like I did, because I was talking and not paying attention to what I was doing. See, you got to watch what you're doing. At this point, I've opened up this section on the opposite side, and I'm going to sew it up now. You don't have to do them opposite, but I like to. I like the tightness that I get. At this point, I've sewn from the very back here, all the way up to this side, and I've sewn all the way up to this side. I have 2 needles over here and 2 needles over here. I basically worked my way up to close to the toe. The problem is all this pulling back would be released if I release the tension, so I have to handle this very carefully. If you had soaked this and it had dried, this wouldn't be an issue. But since I'm doing this all dry, you have to be a little more careful. If you had soaked it, this would just hold its shape no matter what. It's ready, it wants to do what it's doing right now. So I'm going to sew up here a little bit more. Just sew up this section. And I'm going to sew a little bit more on this section, and I'm just going to keep working my way right to the toe. Alright, at this point I've cut the threads. Now it's time to pull them loose. And the toe is just flopping here. There's a couple different ways to tackle the toe. One is to keep doing what you were doing. Another one is to press it down and cut away anything you just don't need. Which is what I'm doing. And then all you have to do is sew it in, and you're in business. At this point, I've worked almost to the toe. We've got 2 more stitches to the toe, and then I'll work up this side, and this part of the shoemaking will be done. You notice that even though I cut it flush, there's still a little bit here that'll have to be cut away. That's because this leather is so very stretchy that just the act of working it has increased its size very slightly. So I awl the holes and I stitch them up. I'm down to the last few stitches. Alright, at this point, all that's left is the actual stitch at the toe. You know what? Actually, I shouldn't put that stitch in because I need to tie these off. So that's what I need to be doing. I'm not thinking about that. Alright. So now I tie carefully the 2 top ones together. Square knot. Sometimes a little extra insurance there. And the same with the other ones on the face. Okay. We're at the same point I was before, except I now need to trim off a tiny little bit of excess. Just caused by the stretching during the process of making holes and things. Alright, now the side seam. It will be easier to sew up the side seam if it's not under tension. So I'm going to do that with it off the last. Now I can simply move it so that it's together, make my holes, and stitch it up. It'll probably only take about 4 stitches. I've pulled out a drawer, and I'm using the very corner of the drawer to give me support. You could do this on the corner of a workbench. I like this height though. And what I'm doing is exactly the same thing I did on the soles, except I'm piercing the edge of the upper leather. This is by far the hardest part, because really what you're doing is you're going through much thinner, much more supple leather. And you have to be super careful. So I go well back from the seam, and I'm pushing forward. This last one is very close to the edge here, so I have to be really careful with what I'm doing. Okay, I've made 4 stitching holes on this part. Now I have to make 4 corresponding ones on the other side. At this point, I'm just double checking all of my holes, making sure they're nice and wide open. I'm putting a lot of finger pressure on them because I sure don't want to rip them at this point. I'm squeezing them, I'm feeling for any ripping, because if any ripping comes, obviously I'm stopping. And I guess I'm ready. Hardest part is finding the holes, because this leather, unlike the sole material, is really soft, so it all feels like you're going through a hole. Alright, I've got my 2 needles, and I've got them on each end of the thread. And I want to do the same thing I had done on the other one. Going halfway through the thickness and coming in. Sometimes if you're having trouble finding the hole, it helps to thread the needles through from both sides so that you can see exactly where you're shooting for. So at this point I've gotten the 2 needles through and I snug it all together so it's nice and tight, and I move on to the next pair of holes. Use the awl to kind of preview where I'm headed. Snug it down and tie it off. Okay, at this point, I can trim this. Right at this point, it's time to turn the shoe right side out, nice and supple. Start with the heel, because that's the easy part to do. You gotta be careful that that seam that you just sewed is, you know what, I'm gonna turn that heel back out. That seam that you just sewed is your weakest link in the whole shoe. You don't want to rip it. So turning the toe is your hard part. Sometimes I find it's good to work it back and forth. And there will probably come a point at which you get stuck and you can't really get it to go any further, and that's alright. You just poke it and prod it, use some tools, and you'll eventually be able to turn the whole thing right side out. Oh, this is fun. You ever had a shoe that you couldn't turn? Sure. I've done that. There is no secret to turning shoes. They simply turn the way they want to, and each one's going to turn differently. Well, yeah, I'm going to wear it like that. Isn't that beautiful? I think the next step is to get some tools involved. I have this steel rod mounted in a vise, and I use it for turning stubborn shoes. And I'm just pushing it up against the sole and pushing it forward. That should do a lot of the turning for me. I'm always putting the rod up against the sole material, not up against the upper portion of the piece. The reason for that is because the sole is much tougher. That wasn't good. Didn't hurt anything though. And it's turning. I'm almost there. There! Look at that. I successfully turned a turn shoe. At this point, we have a finished pair of shoes. Both shoes have been sewn up and turned inside out. You can make shoes like this with a minimum amount of tools, and you can do it in almost any location. This shoe was sewn as shown on the last inside out. This shoe, which turned out identically, was sewn by having the pattern exactly right and sewing it by simply pulling the edges up and stitching it. The finished product is no different. Without the last, you can produce shoes that are just as good. I like the last because they maintain perfect consistency every time. But if you don't have the last, you don't need it. I mentioned there are 3 types of shoemaking you can do with turn shoes. One is wetting the leather and stretching it over last. One is simply stretching over the last. And third is doing it without the last. Any one of these methods can be used with the identical techniques.